I think the risk of India bumping back up to the 26% tariff rate, is a real, threat to sort of, international economic engagement between the countries. I think it will give way to a deal in some form. I don't know how the Modi government will sort of square demands for increased agricultural access for U.S. products into India. I know that's a major sort of pain point politically in India. It's also a major priority on the U.S. side.
You're on the Gist on Strat News Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. Good evening. My guest is Paul Fraioli. He is Senior Fellow for Geopolitics and Strategy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in the US. Paul Fraioli, welcome.
Thank you, Surya. Pleasure to be here.
And we're going to talk to him about US China relations. And let me kick off with my first question, Paul. Could you give us kind of a brief overview as to the US China relationship at this point, and how do you see it going forward?
Yeah, thank you again, Surya. So we're recording in early July, and this is a period where it seems that U.S. and China are in the midst of a de-escalation from a major trade war. So, since U.S. President Donald Trump took office, he took a very tough line on trade issues with China. I think escalated further and faster in terms of tariffs and restrictions on economic interactions between the countries than many people expected. Mutual tariffs between the countries very quickly escalated up to 145% across the board on Chinese exports to the U.S. China imposed its own retaliatory tariffs up to 125%. So this period of sort of de-escalation from that high began in May during negotiations that took place both in London and in Geneva. It was announced in May that in Geneva, a sort of tentative or interim agreement had been reached to climb down from those tariff highs to something much lower, at least as talks continued. And then in the middle of last week, so in the last week of June, it was then announced that a new deal had been signed. And the contours of that deal are still very much to be determined or have not been released publicly. I was expecting that perhaps by this time this week, we'd see more details than we have. But it seems that there's a sort of broad climb down, on an ongoing basis from those tariff highs. So something in the range of 30 to 55% U.S. tariffs at varying rates on Chinese goods coming into the country, and I'm happy to kind of say more about that. But that's broadly where the kind of relationship stands. Very much oriented around trade issues, but broadly sort of climb down from what we saw earlier this year.
So the lack of detail is ominous, is it?
I don't know if it's ominous. I think it's there's high political sensitivity in both countries to the contents of the deal. So for both sides, this will kind of activate public opinion. If there is a lack of substance to it for the U.S. that benefits the U.S., the president may take a political hit from both allies in Congress and from opponents. Perhaps the same on China's side. It does seem that China has agreed to release some of the more stringent restrictions that they had placed on critical critical minerals that are critical to U.S. manufacturing processes, both for civilian technology and for defense technology. So that's one major kind of win for the U.S., but tariff rates are still TBD on that side. I'm guessing that, this can't remain under wraps in perpetuity, and that over the next week or so, we'll see more of what's in the deal.
Is there a concern that the US may have come off second best in this?
Well, I think going into the negotiations, the U.S. just structurally had a weaker hand to play. So, China's manufacturing economy is vast, and the U.S. relies on it at so many levels of the economy. Um, both within the commercial economy and in the sort of defense reliant economy, that it's really hard to envision a way for the two economies to actually divorce in a way that they would have to have divorced had tariffs remained at the plus 100% plus 100% level. So if you think about all of the back and forth that the countries have had, most notably during the Biden administration about chips. Mostly that was over the high-end, very sophisticated semiconductor chips that power electronic devices and that are now being used in artificial intelligence applications. But so many of the chips that China manufactures are sort of what we call kind of low or mid-tier chips, which go into refrigerators and cars and toys and toothbrushes, all of those kinds of consumer devices where if all of a sudden trade had to grind to a halt, there would be massive negative effects in terms of the availability of consumer goods in the United States. So that placed the U.S. in a kind of weak position to kind of go hard after an economic divorce. It was just not a credible threat. I think you saw pretty quickly after those eye-watering tariff rates were announced, the U.S. president had to climb down from those, I think, on two occasions, even to just enter the Geneva negotiations. So that was a sort of sign of the kind of structural imbalance the two countries faced going into negotiations.
So it begs the question, how well does President Trump understand the nuances of trade, tariffs, and so on?
Well, I think the president always came at this question with a big picture concern, right? If you think about his approach during the first term, and if you think about the messaging that he had on this issue during the first campaign back in 2015, 2016, he came at it very much from the perspective of U.S. reliance broadly on Chinese manufacturing is a weakness. The U.S. should be a manufacturer itself. The U.S. should be a trade power as an exporter, not as an importer. So he has always viewed this relationship, and in some sense, his views of China have very much mirrored his views on Japan during the 1990s when Japan was in economic ascendance as a manufacturing power and as a manufacturer of advanced technologies. So I think his views on this were kind of shaped amid the U.S. Japan kind of early kind of manufacturing rivalry in the 1990s. Put that in the 2010s. I think his concerns during the first campaign very much focused on, currency manipulation, which China engaged in the 2010s and early 2010s, but by the mid to late 2010s, a lot of that had been resolved. So his views have always been a bit lagging. I think the same has been true in the second campaign, where actually China did not feature very largely at all, except as a sort of the trade relationship between the countries was controversial. So he's coming at this again from the big picture perspective of the U.S. should be manufacturing things. The U.S. should be an export power, and it's not. Instead, China is. So a lot of the details, I think, are there for the U.S. Trade Representative and the Commerce Secretary. Those types of policy people to fill in. So I think he's probably less interested in the kind of details of the negotiations, but it is very much interested in the big picture, structural imbalances in the relationship, and whether we can move the needle. Whether the U.S. can move the needle towards being more of an export power rather than being an importer of so many goods.
Mhm. What about the issue of fentanyl? Is that something which figures high in these discussions?
So I have not seen any reports either out of Geneva or out of the kind of rumors regarding the trade deal that was signed in the middle of last week that focuses on fentanyl particularly. I think this is an issue that looms large both for President Trump personally, but also for many of the policy people in his administration because of the sort of massive negative effects that the sort of the presence of fentanyl on U.S. black markets has had on the U.S. population and the sort of supply chain going from China and China with fentanyl components through Mexico into the U.S. In fact, it's actually loomed larger as a trade issue in terms of U.S. negotiations with both Canada and Mexico as as potential countries where kind of fentanyl can travel and enter the U.S. from. It hasn't really, at least in terms of the public messaging, played a major role, at least in the last 2 months. We'll see if there's anything that's fentanyl specific in the trade deal once details are revealed, probably in the next week or two.
How does the president see China as a challenge? Certainly, I'm sure, But what else is there in that? What does he see in China?
So I think in terms of um, you know Trump's personal views, I think he has always viewed Chinese President Xi Jinping with kind of a bit of awe and a bit of respect, just in terms of
Mhm.
how he treats him, how he treated him in the first term when they sort of did summitry and had meetings together. I think he is sort of in awe in some sense of the fact that Xi is the sort of primus inter pares in the Chinese system and commands an economy the size of China's economy. China's population, is enormous relative to the U.S. population. So I think he views him as a major figure. I think he views him with respect. Um, in terms of the broader relationship, I think his instinct, as I mentioned earlier, is to really view U.S.-China relations through the lens of international economics, perhaps more than through the security lens. There have not been major security dust-ups between the U.S. and China, in recent memory. So I think we have the luxury, or he has the luxury right now of viewing China in these terms. But I think the last few months of U.S.-China relations will really serve kind of as a template and as a testing ground, because if a deal can be made and if China can be seen to sort of adhere to a deal and the U.S. adheres to its end of the deal going forward, that could tamp down tensions, potentially even on kind of security-related conflicts that might emerge later in President Trump's term. I think uh, President Trump is also apt to view, the U.S. presence more broadly in the Asia Pacific. He's more apt to view that through a sort of, through a two-power lens, where there's the U.S. on one side and there's China on the other, rather than through, the U.S. being sort of part of a lattice work of alliance members, the way, say, the Biden administration viewed U.S. policy in the Asia Pacific. Um, I think a lot of President Trump's, broad approach to the region in terms of its alliances in Japan, with South Korea, with the Philippines, is to be determined. I think I think Japan has been somewhat shaken by the degree to which the administration has
Mhm.
been unpredictable on trade issues. I think there are a lot of frictions behind the scenes as the trade negotiations related to reciprocal tariffs have been underway. There's a deadline of next week of July 9th for negotiating a sort of bilateral deal to avoid reciprocal tariffs. I think this is there's been some friction in U.S. Japan relations that have kind of occurred underneath the surface. So, we'll see how the administration, and if it's able to sort of stitch together, a strong network of allies and partners in the region, including India, Japan, Australia, et cetera, how that comes together. I know Australia was kind of thrown for a loop in June by the announcement that the Defense Department would be doing a sort of top to bottom review of the AUKUS deal involving the sort of exchange of technology and nuclear submarine technology and other technology to see whether it still kind of made sense and adheres to the America First foreign policy agenda. So, there will be moments like that where kind of U.S. allied relations either strained or in a period of transition, and we'll see how that fits into the broader U.S.-China relationship.
Mhm. He's been very tough on allies and partners and friends, hasn't he?
Yes, I agree, and again, this very much fits with, I think, the president's view of foreign relations that goes back 30, 40, maybe even 50 years. So he wrote an op-ed and published it using his own kind of personal income in when he was about 40 years old, which decried both trade imbalances. So we see that in the administration, but also the extent to which he thought the United States was being taken advantage of by allies such as those in Europe and Japan and others. So this idea of burden sharing, the idea that the U.S. gives security guarantees to countries that themselves are wealthy and capable of mounting a strong defense of themselves using their own funds. I think this has always rankled Trump in his mind. So I think this is what drives his approach to being very confrontational on burden sharing issues. And again, we've seen this play out in Europe given the crisis and the war in Ukraine and the sort of questions of burden sharing and the US level of commitment to supporting Ukraine and how that's caused strain in US relations with its allies. In Europe, we'll see how this plays out in terms of Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia.
How does that play out with, say, a country like Taiwan? What is Trump? Taiwan, I find, has been rather low on the radar.
Yeah, I agree. I think so much oxygen has been taken up by high level U.S. China issues, disputes over trade. There has been a bit less. Um, Taiwan has taken up a bit less space in terms of the bilateral agenda. Um, you know, one thing that the President Trump has done is, I think, to sort of reestablish a little bit more firmly the idea of U.S. ambiguity towards the defense of Taiwan. This was a longstanding U.S. position, and President Biden personally, when he spoke of the issue, I think either attempted to or functionally kind of moved the needle a little bit toward being more declaratory and saying the U.S. would absolutely come to Taiwan's defense. President Trump, in his statements on the matter, has really kind of pushed the U.S. back into its traditional ambiguous position. I think there's a new leader in Taiwan, so William Lai has a different sort of approach to U.S. relations, a different approach to
Yeah.
China relations than his predecessor did. I mean, he said some things in the last few months that have raised hackles in China. He said that between China and Taiwan, one is not subordinate to the other. That has really irritated Beijing. He's also said, I think he's referred to Beijing as a foreign hostile force.
Yeah.
So, however, on the U.S. side, there has not been, the one moment in the last presidential term was when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi paid an official visit to Taiwan, which then generated a very sharp
Yeah.
kind of military response from China. So we haven't seen any of that. I mean, you have to wonder, given President Trump's, the way he's approached the war in Ukraine, whether or not there are any lessons to be learned about how he might approach a conflict were it to emerge between China and Taiwan. I mean, I think in some sense he would view the emergence of a conflict like that as a personal affront. That if China were to kind of be the first mover, that China would choose to move against Taiwan while he's president would be personally, I think, problematic and politically problematic for him. At the same time, I think you probably see a desire from his administration to push the sides towards peace before launching into a kind of support of Taiwan in a full-scale war. I think he'd probably, as he has done between Russia and Ukraine, I mean, he would probably try to position himself between the two in ways that make both sides uncomfortable. That is, being a little bit more open to dialogue with a sort of aggressive China, being a little bit tougher on a sort of Taiwan that is under attack, the way he has done between Putin and Zelensky. Those are just guesses about how he would respond if he were going to use the sort of playbook, the way he's approached Ukraine, to approach a
Has
Taiwan
the fact
crisis.
that
I think
he's
trade negotiations are also underway,
sorry.
and so we'll see how those trade negotiations between Taiwan and the U.S. Shape up ahead of July 9th.
Mhm. The fact that every now and then he's pitched himself beyond, say, on issues like trade, perhaps even peace between Russia and Ukraine, peace in Gaza, and then he's kind of rolled back. Has that impacted his standing? Is he seen as perhaps has an element of doubt, skepticism crept into the narrative about Trump?
Well, I think it's less. I think his habitual calls for peace and de-escalation. I think the fact that the world doesn't cooperate with the U.S. The
Yeah.
desires of the U.S. I think is not a surprise to to President Trump's supporters in the U.S. I think what probably was a sort of created a sort of perhaps a larger sense of like, okay, does he mean what he says? Was the decision a few weeks ago by the U.S. to intervene in the Iran-Israel war and participate in a bombing campaign against Iranian nuclear facilities. So I think that sort of probably took many of the president's supporters who have relied on his pro-peace, anti-war in some sense rhetoric, the people who really believed that, I think that challenged their view. And the extent to which you could fairly see Trump as an anti-war figure, I very
Yeah.
much question that view. I'm not sure that's a kind of realistic or sound way to approach
Yeah.
the administration's policy, even though it is in line with the president's rhetoric.
Mhm. Does the administration lack capacity, sufficient people out there who have ideas, who can get things done?
I think it is, there are real questions about sort of policy making capacity. So, you have huge crises in the Middle East, you have huge trade disputes between the US and practically every country in the world. You've got the Russia Ukraine war in a very sort of difficult and unpredictable position. And so, sort of, the administration ideally would be structured in a way that it could respond to all of these crises and problems simultaneously, yet the number of people who are empowered to deal with these problems has really reduced. I mean, you see Steve Witkoff, you know, with multiple portfolios trying to do multiple things at once. At the same time, the kind of traditional policy-making apparatus within the executive branch on foreign policy, the National Security Council, I think the staff has been reduced by more than half. The U.S. is functioning without a national security advisor.
Yeah.
Marco Rubio is playing, two roles. I mean, 2 months ago you had the India-Pakistan crisis. I think the kind of degree to which the administration um, is a bit short-staffed on this came out somewhat during that crisis when
Yeah.
there was, I think an initial desire during the hottest phase of that crisis for the U.S. to sort of take a backseat approach and to let the parties kind of let it play out as it would. But then when it became clear that the parties were really not communicating and that there was a potential for escalation to get out of control, there was a sharp decision to sort of begin to intervene. But then the messaging afterwards, after a ceasefire, was
Yeah.
sort of agreed and had begun to be implemented. The U.S. seemed to have mixed messages, which then I think rankled in Delhi. So I think this is a real concern. The number of people who are kind of able to kind of do policy coordination on the host of crises is lower. You also saw this, when, as I mentioned earlier, there was an announcement in June that the Department of Defense would kind of launch a review of the AUKUS program. This sort of took many people by surprise. It was just sort of, I think it's an idea that came out of one particular office in the Pentagon, and
Mhm.
there was not a lot of sort of preparatory work done in terms of letting the UK and Australia know ahead of time, letting other allies know ahead of time. And so these types of kind of blocking and tackling moves that a kind of more traditionally structured administration would engage in, there's a bit less of that here just because there are fewer people to do so.
Paul, I want to touch on India. I know it's not strictly within your area of study, but India and the US are negotiating a trade deal. I understand 9th is the deadline. It's not clear whether an interim deal is likely or not. Anything you're picking up?
So I have not seen much in terms of credible, intelligence coming out of the negotiations. They're very much, occurring at the sort of, in a quiet way. I think the risk of India bumping um, back up to the 26% tariff rate, is a real, threat to sort of, international economic engagement between the countries. I think it will give way to a deal in some form. I think an interim deal is probably in the cards just because we have, I think, less than a week until that deadline. It's of course possible that President Trump pushes the deadline back just because, in terms of deals announced, I think the only deals that have been announced since the sort of, the sort of backing off of the reciprocal tariff rates and the imposition of the interim deadline of July 9th. There's been a deal with the UK announced. There's been a deal with Vietnam announced. There's been a sort of separate, China deal announced, but not many others. And we've got, every country in the world essentially on the list. I think, I don't know how, the Modi government will sort of square demands for increased agricultural access for U.S. products into India. I know that's a major sort of pain point politically in India. It's also a major priority on the U.S. side, but I'd expect a deal, but probably not by next week.
Hmm. There's a sense in India that President Trump is being unfair, in dealing with this country, given the fact that the U.S. economy is so many times larger, and there are acute issues of poverty and inequalities in India. Does that play out anywhere?
So I don't think that interpretation probably will receive much sympathy within the administration, if I had to guess. If you just look at the sort of deal with Vietnam, I mean, those issues are kind of alive in Vietnam as well.
Yeah.
But it received even tougher treatment in terms of I think the threatened reciprocal rates. I think it was 46%. And there, if you look at Vietnam, it had, it was leaning into manufacturing, it was leaning into transshipment from China, and in the deal that emerged, I think just yesterday, the average U.S. tariff rates on goods imported from Vietnam are still quite high. I mean, I think
Yeah.
they're in the 20% range. And I think on goods transshipped from China or potentially even elsewhere, the rate will be 40%. So if you take a broader step back and look at, where tariff deals are landing and where the current U.S. tariffs are in terms of the rest of the world, even under the sort of interim kind of low tariff uh, rates, which we're in now, which everyone breathed a sigh of relief when they were announced. If you look at them and then kind of go back to 2024 during the presidential campaign, when Trump was campaigning on tariffs, um, economic experts across the board said, "Oh, there's no way he's going to go with tariff rates this high because it'll destroy the U.S. economy, it'll destroy international
Yeah.
economic relationships." And the average tariff rates right now are in line with the worst case predictions in 2024. Setting aside the 125, 145% rates on China, which were just far beyond what anyone predicted. So even in this sort of steady state, which people think, is a relief, tariff rates are really quite high with countries all over the world, not just India, rich, poor, in between. So I think this is just a sort of output of the administration's broader sort of America First outlook on how it should structure its relations with the world.
Last question. What are Trump's public standings? Is he still as popular as ever? Has he lost ground?
So I think the president has been underwater. That is, his approval rating has been below 50%, continuously, both during the first term, during much of the campaign, since elected. So that's not great for any president.
Mhm.
However, I think the latest kind of polling data I've seen is that he's holding steady at whatever it is, 46, 47%. So he's not going down. He's holding steady at a rate that's not great in historical terms, but that's pretty good for Trump. I think in terms of popular opinion, I think the kind of the attacks on Iran, we're still kind of waiting for data to come out. I think that will probably may even raise his standing slightly, only because he'll have been seen, at least in the short term, to be a president who took decisive action, who launched military operations that at least succeeded in the tactical aims of the military operation, and that sort of cut the Gordian knot that administrations have struggled with, for decades. With the medium term and the longer term implications may not be so comforting, but I think in the short term, he'll, if anything, perhaps benefit somewhat in terms of public popularity. I think, though, he'll still have difficulty getting above that 50% threshold.
Paul Fraioli, we are at the end of our time. It's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for that perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much, Surya, for the invitation. I enjoyed the conversation.
That's all we have for you on this broadcast. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on social media. Thank you very much.